right, thank you all. Thank you for joining us. And again, if you could put your name and connection to Woodlawn in the chat. I will start sharing my screen. Can everyone see my screen? If you can let me know, because it just kind of, okay, great. Perfect.
Yes.
Perfect. So there we go. Session goals are housing, social, and economic data regarding the wood.
Actually, Aaron, I can't see your screen.
Yeah, I can't either, Aaron.
Do you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Housing, social, and economic data regarding the Woodlawn area is reviewed. What are the data points? So just thinking when we're talking through these, we'll have two presentations. They're going to have time to present and ask questions. But some of the other things to keep in your mind while having the presentations are what other data points would be helpful for you to know about having in future meetings, in the future, and then what trends should we be keeping an eye on for programming, and then planning for additional data is conducted, and then progress reporting are our overall session goals for today. So here's a quick view of an agenda. But what I also want to say is that we have been engaging over this process for 6 months, and we've set up a timeline at the beginning of this time to meet from March through August. So we've hit the end of our timeline. We are by no means thinking this is the end of our work, but we are planning this meeting to shift our engagement to fit a kind of a longer timeline so that we can work on take in some of the feedback that you've provided and make sure that we're launching the programs that are very thoughtfully. But before I get started on our meeting, I'll pass it over to Commissioner Navarra to speak to you all.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Aaron. And really appreciate your work and your leadership on this. And I want to thank all the guests and speakers who are here to speak to the group tonight, and really appreciate your time. But mostly I want to thank the working group for the time and the work that you've put in over the course of this year, which of course builds on the time and the work that you put in 2019 and 2020 on the Woodlawn Housing Preservation Ordinance. And I kind of see that in two distinct chunks. We did a lot of intense work together, like the second half of 2019 and the very beginning of 2020. Then we had a kind of a COVID pause there for the rest of 2020, where everyone was focused, rightfully so, on getting through that. And then really the first half of this year, as you heard from Aaron just now, March till now, has been the engagement that we committed to in the ordinance, which was to say at the beginning, we commit to a pretty intensive engagement process with the working group, which will then go to every 6 months of a formal commitment to do that. It doesn't mean that's the only time you're going to hear from us, but that's the minimum commitment going forward. So what I want to just say a few things about that, and that is that the work that we've done with all of you has really been helpful for the Department of Housing to inform how we engage with communities more broadly. Many of you might remember that when we first started working together, it was the very beginning of the Department of Housing as a department again, after a decade of being a bureau under the Department of Planning. And there really wasn't a real history, therefore, because we hadn't been a department, of how we engaged with communities and how we did that work thoughtfully. And so the way that we moved forward together has really informed, and the feedback and perspectives that we got from all of you have influenced projects outside of the scope of Woodlawn and the way that we work with communities outside of Woodlawn. So I just wanted to note that and to thank you for that. And at this point, so we have been gathering the needed feedback from the working group to launch the city programs that are outlined in the ordinance. And we'll work quickly to launch those programs now with your feedback. And that's why folks like Esther Sorrell from the Department of Housing are here to talk about what that looks like on the ground, and how we'll continue to work on that. So as Aaron said, this is not the conclusion of the department's work with the working group, but it is the conclusion of this this kind of cadence of working together, this much more frequent meetings, because we had all of the programs within the ordinance to work through and really get your feedback and influence on. Now that we've worked through those, we've now got an implementation plan, which Aaron will walk you through. So you'll still be receiving updates from the department on our progress, and we'll continue to be a trusted advisory group. Again, it's not that you won't ever hear from us between now and February. It's just that's our minimum commitment, would be to meet again in February with updates. But we'll continue to have reporting on reviewing data, tracking program progress, and making adjustments as needed. We anticipate coming back to you all frequently with things like, hey, our outreach in this arena, is lacking a little in this way. Do you have some ideas for us on how we can improve that? Things of that nature. I mean, I think that's what we envision and what we hope is an ongoing partnership. So with that, I just want to say thank you again for the ways that we've been able to work together and the path that we've been on together. And I also just want to thank Aaron for his work and his leadership, bringing this part of the process to a point where we can now go out and implement this work, which is what we've all been waiting for. So thanks, Aaron. I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you for sharing that. So just to overview, we will have time in this meeting to talk about the next steps, which is the last thing on our agenda, but talk about what that engagement will look like moving forward in a little bit more detail. But before we get to that, we will have a presentation from Jeff Smith, who is joining us from the DePaul Institute of Housing Studies on displacement pressure data. And then from Stacy Young from the CIC and the Preservation Compact on the state of legally restricted affordable housing in Woodlawn. And joined with her is Esther Sorrell from the Department of Housing as well. And then we'll have a discussion on timeline and what we've accomplished over our time so far, and then again, planning for next steps and what the continuing engagement will look like. So I will share my screen. No, I will pass it off to, who is this, Jeff? Jeff first. So I will pass it to Jeff.
Thanks, Aaron. Good afternoon or evening, I guess. Good evening, everybody. So what I will do is share my screen here. So my name is Jeff Smith. I'm the executive director of a place called the Institute for Housing Studies. We are based at DePaul University in the Department of Finance and Real Estate. We collect a lot of different kinds of data on housing market activity, produce a number of different outward-facing reports and data indicators that hopefully help people understand different aspects of the housing market in the city, affordable housing in the city, how that looks like, in different neighborhoods, and then work with a lot of different types of stakeholders, practitioners to connect that data to different work that's happening around housing policy, neighborhood investment patterns, stuff like that. So the data here, I'm going to present today is really going to start with just a high-level overview of rental housing affordability trends in the city, and then kind of transition and drill down a little further into what's happening in Woodlawn. One pretty important, significant footnote would be that data is notoriously lagging. And therefore, in a situation where you have a big event like, let's say, a global pandemic that might affect real estate market investment and whatnot, and that some of these data, we're trying to interpret them in a certain way, and really, some of the data that will be presented predate the pandemic because that's just the most current data that we have available. Some data will have some of the transactional data will take place during the pandemic. And, so I think just putting that out there, that part of the art of data analysis in some cases is interpreting it. And so we do our best to interpret it, but we also rely on folks who know the community and who live in the community and work in the community to help us refine those interpretations. So throughout the presentation or at the end of the presentation, if there are certain data points that jump out at you or seem interesting, or you have a certain perspective on those, absolutely would love to discuss it and hear more about it, because we're also trying to kind of digest some of these data points and understand kind of what they really mean on the ground. So with that being said, one of the long-term trends that we've seen in the city, I'd say long-term, really starting in 2012, has been the steady loss of the affordable rental housing supply in Chicago. Those are the number of units that would be affordable to lower income households. Between 2012 and 2019, the city lost about 10% of its affordable rental stock. Over that same period, the rental supply grew by over 4%. So losing affordable stock, gaining other stock that would be market rate housing. A lot of the new investment, new development you see in the city is not affordable. So, that pattern and trend creates, mismatch, especially in certain places, between the need for affordable housing and the availability of affordable units. So I'll kind of show us what that pattern looks like in a minute. But after getting into that, we'll kind of drill down into Woodlawn and talk about some certain investment patterns on the multifamily, single family, 2 to 4 unit rental stock. I see Commissioner Navarro has a question, so I will let her ask it.
Just a quick question, Jeff. When you say Chicago lost nearly 10% of its affordable rental stock, is that subsidized, restricted rental, or naturally occurring, or a mix?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we don't necessarily have the data broken down exactly in that way, but I believe it's primarily through the naturally occurring affordable rental stock. And some of the data that we look at tracking the, I would say the overlap between areas where we've lost affordable rental housing and areas where you see rising prices and displacement pressure. The overlap of those two areas would definitely point to the naturally occurring stock as being the most vulnerable and being lost due to rising prices, due to issues like demolition of 2 to 4 unit properties, being replaced by single family homes, or just being left vacant for whatever reason. So certainly that naturally occurring stock is really important because there are limited protections to keep it affordable. So that's sort of our assumption, that it's really the NOAA stock that's most under pressure. So just to give a sense of the spatial pattern of affordability in the city, this is a map that looks at the percent of rental units that would be considered affordable. Lots of different ways to calculate affordability. We use one way, other people use different ways, but I think that regardless of the way you calculate it, the pattern is probably going to look pretty similar. In this map, the areas with the lightest shade are those with the smallest share of the rental stock would be considered affordable. We look at the number of housing units that would be affordable at 30% of the income of someone earning 150% of the federal poverty level, which usually translates to a rent of about $950 a month, gross rent per month, and roughly a $37,000 household income. So if you look, along the lakefront, that South Lakefront submarket is where you would find Woodlawn, kind of near the southern end of it. If you look at some of the indicators that we calculate to try to understand affordability, this shows that the share of affordable units in the sort of South Lakefront submarket, about 52% of the rental units in that submarket are affordable, compared to about 40% citywide. Looking at the number of lower income renters as a share of total renters, about 64% of the renters in the South Lakefront submarket would be considered lower income, compared to roughly 49% in the city. And the share of lower income households that are living in a unit that we would consider unaffordable or higher cost, 35% compared to 40% in the city. So those are some just basic indicators that we track. When we look at the change over time, we can understand where some of that affordability pressure is. And just to kind of get back to the question of what's the nature of the stock that's being lost, by looking at this map, We see the areas that are losing the highest, who's seen the percent of their overall stock affordable decline the fastest would be areas on the northwest side of the city. Those tend to be the areas that have experienced the most rapid increases in house prices and investment, driving some of the loss of that naturally occurring stock. But you also see, again, on places like the South Lakefront, you do see a decline in the, and along the lakefront in general, you do see a decline in the affordable stock. How that looks like, again, South Lakefront compared to the city, the patterns are pretty similar, actually. South Lakefront area lost a slightly smaller share of its affordable rental stock, 4.7 percentage point decline compared to 5 percentage point decline in the city. The share of renter households that are low income declined. Why those declines happen, it could be lower income households got more income and they're no longer considered lower income. Could be they left the city and were replaced in some ways by other households that maybe are higher income, so the turnover in the population. But either way, loss of low-income households in general, and then an increase in the share of low-income households that are in higher cost housing.
Jeff, could you potentially speak up a little bit or move to the?
Oh yeah, sure. Sorry.
To the mic. Yeah, thank you so much.
Sure thing. I will speak up and stand closer to the mic. So in general, when we think about why is some of this stuff happening, why are these patterns taking place? We think about rising rents driven by market demand are one reason why you lose affordable rental supply. You also could lose it by the loss of units in different ways. Demolition, as I mentioned earlier, demolition of a 2-flat. That 2-flat gets replaced by a single family home. You've lost 2 units that are potentially affordable, and you haven't replaced them with any type of rental housing or affordable housing. Or in some other neighborhoods, you might just lose housing to demolition because it's in a more of a disinvested market context, and that property has been vacant, experienced deterioration, and has been demolished demolished because of that deterioration. So why, what are some of the, so we developed some leading indicators, what we call leading indicators, to sort of anticipate or think about where some of these types of activities might happen. One leading indicator is understanding current house prices and how those house prices are changing. That helps us understand current levels of affordability and shifts in demand as prices go up. That's an indicator that there is some type of shift in demand for housing in those neighborhoods. And that shift in demand via rising prices can tell us where the market might be moving and get ahead of that lost affordability of prices in that location are currently relatively affordable. Length of ownership, there's some, Stacy may or may not talk about this, but we've had a lot of conversations with the Preservation Compact trying to understand some of the characteristics of the naturally occurring affordable housing stock. And one assumption that I think a lot of folks make, and it's reasonable, is that the naturally occurring affordable housing stock is most likely to be found in properties that have been owned continuously by the same owner for a longer period of time, because when you purchase a property in, say, the 90s, your costs of ownership based on that initial purchase price are lower than if you purchased a property in 2019 when prices are higher. So when a person who owned that property for 20 plus years sells it to a new buyer, it resets many of those assumptions and some of the pricing of that and the financial model of that unit, which is where you get at the turnover of that housing stock and how prices look. So understanding sort of where that turnover is happening and where prices are changing. And then also just the loss of the stock in general. So, and then the market context is helpful and important to interpreting some of those trade trends and data. So I'm going to go through some of those indicators for Woodlawn.
Jeff, if I may interrupt for a second,
Yeah.
I have a question. So, and if you can go back to the last slide, and looking at those leading indicators, how often would you say it's, what's best practice in terms of how often you should look at those indicators, or they should be updated and used to influence kind of policy or program decisions?
So for all of these indicators, the leading indicators, we have developed using administrative data. So these are administrative data sets that are updated annually. I mean, they're actually updated internally pretty regularly. We tend to conduct our analyses annually. So for example, right now, some of these data we have through 2020, that we have data in our data warehouse through 2021 for the first quarter. So I do think that to be timely, probably a fairly regular updating of these indicators as available is most practical. Though, again, with data, there's a lot of noise sometimes. So really, it requires some, ongoing analysis to sort of sift through some of that noise, especially, for example, during a time like the pandemic where you're having some volatility in the real estate market for different reasons. So understanding what's causing that volatility and understanding sort of if that's a short-term effect of, for example, not being able to buy properties for a quarter or two, or if that's a real change in the market, for example. So I think there is some interpretation that's required, caution required when working with administrative data, but we try to do it annually. We try to use the most current data available. We would use census data, which is a little more lagging of a data set, more as contextual data on things that are maybe less dynamic than the real estate market. I see Savannah has a question.
Yes, I was going to ask, you may have gone over this. What does MF stand for in turnover and rising MF?
Yeah, sorry, that's multifamily. So they're 5+ unit multifamily rental properties. So apologies for my shorthand. Should have fixed that before closing out this presentation. So this is a map of Woodlawn that we, the colors of the map are based on market typologies that we've created, based on, in part, sales activity. So if you look at this map citywide, you would see 3 value tiers: high cost, moderate cost, low cost. In the citywide map, high cost areas would be red, moderate cost areas would be green, the lower cost areas would be blue. Essentially, there's a lot of fancy data work that goes behind it, but essentially those higher cost areas are areas where 1 to 4 unit property sales are in the highest third of property sales in the city. Those moderate cost areas would be in the middle third. Low cost areas would be in the lower third. The darkness of the shade of the color represents how intensely prices are increasing. So the darker colors are prices that are increasing faster than peer neighborhoods in that value tier. So the price appreciation is compared to other properties that are moderate cost, or other properties that are lower cost, or other properties that are higher cost. So on this map, you would see that essentially East Woodlawn is moderate cost, so roughly near the city average. But the darker green areas are those where prices are appreciating at above the average of peer moderate cost areas. I know that for those who know Woodlawn will know that the eastern third of the neighborhood is not really residential, but so we just didn't block off the park as part of the non-residential land use for this particular neighborhood. And then again, the blue area is West Woodlawn, where you have lower values. So the values are in the lower kind of part of the lower third of cities on aggregate, but you do see those prices rising above the average of those pure properties. So just to kind of dig into some of the numbers behind this. So this is just Woodlawn-wide data. Looking at the sale prices of 1 to 4 unit properties, how they slot into certain value tiers. So you would read this as the gray tells you that in 2020, for example, 33% of 1 to 4 unit properties in Woodlawn sold for greater than $300,000. That was an increase of over, say, 2017, where 15% of 1 to 4 unit properties sold for over $300,000. So you see between 2017 and 2020 and into early 2021, you see a pretty substantial shift in the share of total sales of 1 to 4 unit properties that were in that sort of higher price point of 300,000 greater. This looks at, again, just kind of isolating that 300,000 price point and the share of sales at the price point, looking at kind of East and West Woodlawn, knowing that there are certain submarkets within the neighborhood. So West Woodlawn obviously is lower cost, as you saw from the earliest slide. But you see, in 2017, just under 3% of the 1 to 4 unit sales in West Woodlawn were over 300,000. That share has increased to just over 22% by 2020. In East Woodlawn, 33% or 33%. You saw a pretty big jump in 2020 to almost 57%. You look at sort of how that compares to the city, you see that between 2017 and 2019, East Woodlawn in many ways is pretty close to the city in terms of the share of sales that were in that sort of 300,000 plus price point. 2020, you saw the jump. You saw a big jump in the city, but you saw an even bigger jump in the East Woodlawn neighborhood. And then just how does that translate to median sales prices? So again, the median sales price of 1 to 4 unit properties. West Woodlawn went from 83,000 to about 200,000 between 2017 and 2020, about 230 to 317 between 17 and 20 in East Woodlawn, and then a slightly smaller increase in the city of Chicago, about 230,000 to 279,000. It is possible that Woodlawn had the median sale of in 2017, just because the median sales price is the same in both East Woodlawn and the city of Chicago. So I'm going to try something fancy. If it doesn't work, apologies. But this is, let me know if you can see this map. Can you see the interactive map here?
Yes.
Okay, so this is a map that looks at 1 to 4 unit building sales. Each of these dots represent a parcel that was sold between 2017 and 2021. The orange would be a single family home. The shade would be, the darker shade would be a higher cost property, the lighter shade a lower cost property. So this is what the pattern of single family sales between 2017 and 2021 looks like. You can isolate, say, look at 2017 and see what the pattern looks like in 2017. So these are the properties that sold in 2017. You can see higher value sales. This market typology was based on more recent sales data. So lower value sales in this particular quadrant likely were reflective of maybe some pre-flipping activity. If you look at 2020, you can see how some of that sales activity has changed for single family properties. Similarly, looking at 2 to 4 unit properties, you can see where the 2 to 4 sales activity took place, relative price, lighter colors or lower value. You can see what that looks like in 2020 and how some of the patterns have changed, some of the pricing has changed. So I see there's Naaman has a question.
Yes, thanks, Jeff. I do have a quick question. So, you're looking at the increase in sales price. Is there any way, with the data from the data source that you guys are pulling from, to parse out cash sales or sales to institutional buyers?
So we have been playing around with the data a bit, and one thing that we can look at businesses versus individual sales. So we have a little tooltip here. So you can see that, for example, in 2020, 108 sales of 2 to 4s. Of those 108 sales, this is the rough distribution of who the seller was and who the buyer was. So 44 of those sales were from a business entity to an individual. 28 from an individual to an individual. You saw a smaller share being purchased by business entities. One of the things that we've seen, particularly in 2020 and into 2021, has been an increase in individual buyers. We've seen that in lots of neighborhood contexts. On the south side, we've done a deep dive in Chatham and Auburn Gresham, and seen a pretty similar trend that you see a big growth in individual buyers, be they from business entities or individuals, and those transactions tend to be at higher price points. So at this point, at least, it doesn't seem like at least the predominance of sales activity, or at least what's driving sales price increases at the moment, is investors. But that's not to say that if there's some distress in the market due to foreclosure activity post pandemic, when a lot of the different protections are removed, that type of activity couldn't take place. But at the moment, it seems like individual buyers are driving the market at the moment.
Interesting. That seems like something that we should keep an eye on going forward, though.
So now, if my fanciness is working, can you see my PowerPoint presentation now? Is this back to the presentation? All right.
A quick
Amazing.
question, Jeff, before
Yes.
you move forward. On the prior slide, you were showing how what the average prices were for 1 to 4 unit properties in both East Woodlawn and West Woodlawn. Could you flip back to that for a second?
Is this the slide you're talking about?
Yes, sir. I just want to
Yeah.
grab a couple of numbers off of that real quick, and you can go right ahead, sir.
Great.
Thank you.
Another thing that we've been tracking is the loss of the 2 to 4 unit building stock. So we, have over the years really honed in on the 2 to 4 unit building stock as a really particularly important segment of the housing market in the city. It makes up a big portion of the overall housing stock in a lot of neighborhoods. It often is the most affordable type of housing, type of rental housing in a lot of neighborhoods. The units in 2 to 4 unit properties are often family-sized units, meaning they can accommodate large, multiple bedrooms, so they can accommodate families. A lot of newer construction rental properties are smaller, so they don't necessarily have the ability to accommodate families. So they fill a particular role in the city's naturally occurring affordable housing stock. But one of the things that we've seen is that they've been lost. That you've seen a decline in 2 to 4 unit properties in the city, and that's what we think is a big driver of the overall loss of affordable rental housing in the city. Did an analysis to see what that looked like citywide. So between 2013 and 2019, this is a really exciting chart. I'll just say it shows basically that the city lost about 4.2% of its 2 to 4 unit, the 2 to 4 unit parcels citywide. Woodlawn, again, right about average with the city, losing about 4.4%. If you look at why and how the stock was lost, we see a little bit of a different pattern. So the dark so what this shows is of all the parcels that were lost, all the 2 to 4 parcels that were lost in Woodlawn, 36% were lost due to a conversion to a single family home. Meaning in 2013, the property was a 2-flat. By 2019, it somehow become a single family home. That's what SF stands for, single family. That number is 44% citywide. So a little bit more conversion activity citywide than you see in Woodlawn. The other predominant category is non-residential, meaning the property went from being a 2 to 4 unit property in 2013 to being non-residential in 2019. The most common type of non-residential land use that we see in the data was a vacant lot. So the property went from a 2-flat to being a vacant lot. So again, I'm gonna try another fancy interactive map thing. So what this shows is in this, this is Woodlawn. The dark colors are the areas that saw the biggest loss, or in terms of the number of 2 to 4 unit parcels. So we can look at this tooltip here and see that, so you actually can click on the link here and see that this track lost 27 2 to 4s. Of those 27 2 to 4s, 22 were lost to some type of non-residential use. That means now they are non-residential use, which again is most likely a vacant lot. Don't know exactly if that's what happened in Woodlawn, but it is some type of non-residential land use now. 4 were converted to a single family home. If you look at different part of Woodlawn, you see that in this area 9, 2 to 4s are lost. Of those, 7 were converted to a single family home. 1 was converted to some type of non-residential land use. If you zoom out here, you get a sense of what the city looks like. You can see a lot of the conversion activity is taking place on the north side. If you click on this thing, you see these are the tracks where single family conversion was the most common type of loss of 2 to 4s. And flip it over to see these are areas where conversion to some type of non-residential land use is most common. So you see that, if you've been following the kind of some of the patterns in the map, areas where there is sort of a higher level of investment and lost affordability pressures also tend to be where you're seeing the loss of 2 to 4s to single family homes. Areas that have a history of disinvestment tend to be the areas where you're losing it more likely to vacant land. Savannah, you had a question?
Yes, and you just answered it. I was just making sure that the last graph that you showed was referring to low income and affordable housing. with the conversion?
Are you talking about this one?
Yeah.
So this is not, so in this case, we don't know if the unit was affordable. So we're making some assumptions by the notion that the 2 to 4 unit building stock is important because citywide, it tends to provide lower cost rental housing. You know, there's a higher share of, I can share some links to some reports that we recently put out, but you know, overall, looking at the 2 to 4 unit stock, we know that a higher percentage of units in 2 to 4 unit buildings rent for below $900 rent, for example, which would be a threshold for affordability that we tend to track. We know that a higher percentage of the units in 2 to 4 unit buildings have multiple bedrooms, have 3 or more bedrooms, again, implying that these are family sized units. We know that those types of units are concentrated in certain neighborhoods that are more likely to be lower income, lower moderate income neighborhoods, more likely to have high African American or Latinx populations. So they serve those populations more than, you know, a higher percentage of those Latinx renter households live in 2 to 4 unit properties than other types of properties. So piecing all that together, you know, we think this is an important component of the kind of more the naturally occurring affordable rental stock than the subsidized affordable rental stock. And its loss just kind of puts more pressure on the broader rental market because you're losing those affordable units and you're not necessarily replacing them with anything that would be equally affordable. And then really quickly, you know, I'm running out of time here, you know, thinking about turnover of the bigger multifamily properties, the 5+ unit multifamily properties, you know, trying to, as I mentioned earlier, we kind of hone in on this set of properties that have been owned continuously by the same entity for at least, say, 20 years. So this chart shows properties that are, you know, rental properties with 5 or more units that were last sold in different, you know, periods of time. So the dark blue bar are properties, the percent of all of the multifamily parcels that last sold at least, you know, they haven't sold since 2000 basically. They've been owned continuously for at least 20 years. That type of ownership makes up the plurality of ownership of multifamily properties in the city. The second biggest would be properties that have sold since 2013. So why does that matter? You know, I think it matters because if you look at the prices of when you bought the property versus, you know, if you bought it in 2000, you're typically going to pay a lot less. You know, Woodlawn, the property that was purchased in 2000, the median price per unit was about $26,000. Citywide, the median price per unit was about $23,000. So if you bought your property then and then you sold it in 2019, the new buyer was going to pay more per unit for that same property. So in Woodlawn, they would have paid $67,000 per unit. Citywide, they would have paid $70,000 per unit. So just by the nature of that type of change, you know, I think if you look at different neighborhoods, that pattern is different. You know, I think the market context is a really important component of how we interpret this number, but just that change in the sales price per unit implies that there may be some concerns that new owner will have to or anticipates charging higher rents to either justify that higher purchase price. And it's an indicator again of sort of rental housing demand and potential you know, rental housing affordability. You know, interpreting this particular number, you know, it would seem that Woodlawn's prices have gone up faster than the city average, but the current transaction price is about average. So kind of in line with what we see as sort of a moderate cost or, you know, market, but a rising market. And sort of again, one of these leading indicators that might point to some concerns about lost affordability on that sort of naturally occurring side of the market. And then just looking at West versus East Woodlawn, again, the 2020 numbers are a bit hard to interpret, especially for the multifamily side, because on single family and 1 to 4 unit housing, really strong year for prices. On the multifamily side, a little bit less clear on the price trends, but you can see sort of what the, you know, 5+ unit sales activity looks like on a price per unit basis in East and West Woodlawn. And again, because I figured out how to do this and I'm just gonna keep doing it, is how to jump into one of these interactive maps. You know, this is the same one we saw earlier, but you know, this is looking at multifamily. So the green are sales of 5+ unit properties. And the dark color represents the, again, that's the price, not necessarily the price per unit. If you look at properties that sold in 2020, click on this tooltip and you can see this one was, 60, a $1.4 million sale, price per unit about 67,000 per unit. You kind of see, the differences in some of these different sales, based on their location, their value, their price per unit. Just a way to explore the data a little bit and see what the patterns look like. And that's, I think, all. So not sure if there are any other questions that folks had, but happy to answer or just happy to hang out and listen to Stacy and answer questions that might come up. I think Mr. or Mrs. Hardy, I'm not sure, has a question.
I do have a question. I've read a couple of studies and it suggests that there is enough affordable housing in Woodlawn. I asked if there has been a study commissioned to actually look at that question. Is there any talk about actually examining that question and projecting out, given the data that you've presented this evening? If there is a need for affordable housing, and if so, how much?
I think that gets to the, I don't know that I have a great answer to your question, but I would say that some of it's, the definition of affordable. I know that, and maybe Stacy has this data point, but handy, but I know that Woodlawn tends to have a bit more subsidized housing as a percent of its total housing stock than other neighborhoods in the city. So there is, subsidized housing in the neighborhood. And when you compare it to other parts of the city, it might be higher. So the market rate or the naturally occurring affordable housing, again, it's sort of, it's there, but our data would indicate general affordability on average for the neighborhood, but that, that's not necessarily guaranteed to be affordable. And so when you are concerned about how catalytic investments, I know that, there's concern about the Obama Presidential Center, there's concerns about other, anchor institutions, perhaps, that just the attractiveness of the neighborhood will attract outside investments and drive prices up. That's always a dynamic number. So, so I don't know. Yes, I think it would depend on how you want to quantify, what is affordability. You talk about the subsidized, kind of dedicated affordable housing side of things. We're talking about the market rate, naturally occurring side. Might have a different answer.
Jeff, I can jump in and note that one of the things is, as far as restricted affordable, so properties that have, must be rented at a rate that's affordable, as opposed to naturally occurring, which can change if values go up. In terms of properties that are restricted affordable, Woodlawn is at about 30% of its housing stock is restricted affordable housing. And in comparison to other community areas, there's only a handful, less than 5 other community areas of the 77 that are higher than that. So that is a fairly high percentage. That doesn't mean that, but it's a different question to say, is that enough for everyone who lives in Woodlawn? However, it's simply to say, compared to other community areas, it's fairly high. The process we went through with the working group was to say, everyone who lives in Woodlawn now should be able to afford to stay in Woodlawn now. And that really, I think, led our plans for how we thought about land that the city owns and the fact that we can control what happens on that land and the affordability on that land, because the other good news is that the city owns a lot of vacant land in Woodlawn. And so we have a higher level of control about what happens in those spaces than in many communities that have experienced rising prices. So so I think those are a couple additional factors at play, just to add to what Jeff said.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to make sure that Stacy's able to present. So I guess, Esther, if you can ask your question, and then we'll move right on to Stacy.
I was going to just piggyback off of what the commissioner said in response to Ms. Hardy's question. In the asset that my asset management team and I spent a good portion of the summer last year trying to answer that very question. I had a bit of information that I was going to back Stacy up during her presentation. But yes, we have worked on this study. We continue to work on this study. It's completely anecdotal. We were generally reviewing non-subsidized, non-government supported housing. So basically naturally occurring housing and market rate housing. I do have some numbers. The pool is limited, but it is showing that of unrestricted properties, the trend is going upward in Woodlawn. So I'll turn it back over to you, Aaron, so Stacy can do her presentation.
Oh, thank you for that, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that when Stacy's presentation too.
Excellent. Well, I'll just get started. I'll share my screen here and just want to say thank you so much for inviting me to present tonight. This is a wonderful opportunity, and I'm sorry. There we go. Can you see that? Are people seeing? No? Are people seeing that?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Okay. Excellent. So I'm Stacy Young. I'm at Community Investment Corporation, and I'll talk a little bit about what CIC does. And I do feel bad. I'm the second presenter in an evening meeting, and if we were in person, I promise I would have brought cookies. That is the only reason anyone comes to my meetings, is because I always have cookies and things to keep people awake, because I know, especially at this time of evening, it's tough. So thank you all. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about CIC. I think some of you might have been at the last meeting and heard my colleague Jonah Hess talking about CIC and some stuff we're doing in Woodlawn. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time. My main topic is really looking at that restricted housing that the commissioner and Esther were just talking about, and making sure that the government assisted properties, again, that restricted housing in Woodlawn, that we're paying attention to it, that we're making sure that the housing that's there that does have government assistance or is restricted stays that way and stays affordable in a good condition for the folks who live in Woodlawn. So Community Investment Corporation, again, really quickly, we're a nonprofit lender. That doesn't mean that we don't want our loans to get repaid. We do need our loans to get repaid. But our core business is lending. We lend to owner operators of apartment buildings so they can buy and fix up buildings. These could be 6 flats or 24 or even 50 unit buildings. Our borrowers are typically small businesses, small owners. We certainly finance larger owners as well. Most of them are pretty small. Half of our borrowers are led by people of color or women. And, we can be more creative than a for-profit commercial lending institution, but again, we don't give our money away. We're just a lender. We make loans. And you heard from Joan at the last meeting about one of those creative funds that we put together, the Woodlawn Construction Fund. Another thing that Jonah might have mentioned last time is our partnership with the City of Chicago on building code enforcement. I'm not going to get into that tonight, but the idea is to go after bad owners and fix up troubled rental buildings. We also do some other direct interventions with properties. We also do property management training to try to build the capacity of small owners, because management is such an important activity, and we want all the owners and managers of rental buildings to do a great job. Last but not least, we do head up a policy collaborative as well, but I'll get more into that in a couple of minutes. So again, I'm not going to dig in deep here. You can read through these numbers. We've been lending since 1984. We got started because the bigger commercial lenders were not active in many historically disinvested neighborhoods. But of course, those neighborhoods and building owners need to be able to borrow money to fix up buildings in those neighborhoods. And that's why lending is so important. And that's how CIC came into being in 1984. So you can see again under financing, we've done a lot since 1984. I just mentioned we have that enforcement program against the bad owners that I just mentioned. We also help acquire troubled buildings, some small, some large. And the idea is we try to turn around those bad buildings into good assets for the neighborhood. And again, happy to talk about that later. And again, we're really proud of our property management training, that capacity building of managers and owners, as I just mentioned. We've trained 20,000 people through that program. And I'm happy to take questions again about all CIC's work, but I'd really like to get to the meat and potatoes here of the work that I really want to talk about. Let me see here. And this slide is not moving. Let's see. There we go. I'm going to talk just for a quick minute about this policy piece, because this is really what we're modeling. So this whole, what I'm going to talk about tonight is how important that government restricted. Again, there's a lot of rental housing. Only some of it is affordable. Some of that affordable housing, Jeff and the commissioner and Esther were just talking about, some of it doesn't have any kind of government restriction on it at all, doesn't have any kind of subsidy on it at all. It, has rents that are more affordable than other rents in other buildings because the values in those neighborhoods are a little bit lower. And then there's the subsidized housing, the government restricted housing. And that's something that is kind of, it's on these buildings. It's something that we need to actively work at to keep in place to make sure those units stay affordable. And what we've done with these properties in Woodlawn is create something that the Preservation Compact, which is this policy group, created. So we work on lots of policies to preserve affordable rental, property taxes, energy efficiency, lots of different things. But I'm going to spend most of my time here talking about the Interagency Council, which we've been convening for about the last 12 years. Big shout out to Esther and a bunch of colleagues from the city of Chicago who are really great participants in this group for the past 12 years. And so again, everything I'm talking about is right now about government subsidized, this restricted affordable rental housing. I'm always happy to talk about rental buildings that don't have subsidy, but again, we're really focused on this specific universe of properties tonight. So the next two slides I'm going to talk about really highlight government coordination that we've been doing for the past 12 years or so, that really, the work that we've done has covered the entire region, most of it in the city of Chicago. And the idea is that governments work together. They know each other, the staff maybe are even friends, but they don't always have the time and the luxury of time to look ahead and be really proactive and try to identify problems before the problems happen. So that's what this group is. So we're looking at all the government assisted properties because we have data on it, right? Because the government has done things to these properties and government is keeping track. So we have this data. And what we do is we look at the data, we get feedback from our government partners, and I'll talk about them I'll talk about them in a minute. We also get feedback from community groups and tenant groups. And then after we have all this information, we look at it together and we try to figure out what are the most important properties for us to pay attention to. We work with the government agencies so that they can reach out to the owners and try to figure out what's happening. We have a lot of discussions with owners. We talk to tenants to understand what's happening. And in some cases, not all the time, not very often, but sometimes we actually work to get those buildings to be purchased by preservation developers and owners who will keep those subsidies in place and keep those buildings affordable. I'm sorry here. So I'm sorry, I'm backing up a little bit. So I want to make sure that I talk about all these government assistants, all these government agencies who are coming to these meetings, because these are all the same agencies that are really focused on Woodlawn right now. So over the years, we've brought HUD together, the city of Chicago, the state agency that takes care of subsidized housing, IDA, the Illinois Housing Development Authority, Cook County, the Chicago Housing Authority, and as I said, community groups. And so again, the idea is that all these groups are coming together and we're doing what I just said. We're really looking at the data. We're also talking to tenant groups and then looking forward as we identify which properties might be at risk. We want to make sure that we're being really proactive. Again, the government agencies are reaching out, we're reaching out and making sure that these properties stay affordable if we can get them to stay affordable. And we can't always, but sometimes we can. So the types of things that we're looking at when we say, what's what kind of properties are we spending the most time looking at, right? So if there are, I believe there's around 60 or 70 government assisted properties in Woodlawn. And these are apartment buildings. And there's other ones too. The ones that we're able to track are about in that number. And what we're trying to do is figure out which ones are at risk. Which are the ones that we should be paying attention to, because we can't focus on 70 buildings. We can focus on 10, maybe 20. We can't focus on 70. And so the way that we try to figure out which are the most important, we're looking at the conditions of the buildings, right? Because we want buildings to be in good condition. If they're not, then we're like, okay, let's pay more attention to that one. We're looking at the type of building. So some buildings serve seniors, some buildings serve families, and those have different types of risk factors. And so we're looking at that. We're looking at the market type. Jeff just spent a lot of time talking about West Woodlawn and East Woodlawn, and that, there are market pressures. In other words, the prices are going up faster in East Woodlawn. Parts of West Woodlawn, the prices are going up too. And then we also look at the subsidies themselves. When do they expire? So they have these like time limited contracts on them. And so of course, if that's coming up in the next 5 years or even 10 years, sometimes we want to pay more attention to it. So we look at all these different things. We also look at the owners. Who owns these buildings? Do they have a track record of keeping the buildings in good shape? Do they have a track record of keeping the subsidies in place? Do we know these owners? Do we need to get to know these owners? And so I'm saying all this because what we've done as a result of the city, again, focusing like a laser on Woodlawn, is to take this work that we've been doing over the last 12 years on a regional basis and focus like a laser on Woodlawn. So we're looking at all of those factors that I just mentioned, looking at conditions, looking at the subsidy itself, looking at the owner, looking at when the subsidy expires, and trying to figure out, are some of these properties at risk? Should we be spending more time looking at these properties in order to make sure they stay affordable for the long haul? So that's what we are starting to do with this group of government agencies that I just talked to you about. We've got some data. I'll show you the source of the data here. So this is a map that this links to a map with all the government assisted properties all over Illinois. And again, what we want to try to do is narrow down in Woodlawn, look at that list of affordable properties, government assisted restricted properties in Woodlawn, figure out which ones are most at risk, gather as much information as we can, and try to make sure that those properties stay affordable. So, the most important thing, and the reason I'm so excited that we're able to talk to you all tonight, is because we have the government agencies. We can call them, they're at their computers, they can share data with us, they can share information with us. But what's really important are those boots on the ground. What's really important are the people who live in the neighborhoods, the people who might even live in the buildings themselves, who can provide information that we can't see on our communities, on our computer screens. So it's really important that we have information, so if you all have questions about some buildings where you're not sure if they have government assistance, or you think they do and you want more information, we have a lot of information about these government assisted properties. And we're working now with that group of government agencies that I just listed, again, to narrow that down. And we're hoping that to the extent you have information about these properties, you can share that with us. So we can see what's vulnerable from our computer screens, but we don't have the information that you have. And we can't promise to fix everything either. Sometimes it's very difficult to get the owners to make changes, but we do our best, and we have the right people in the room from those government agencies, and they can make phone calls that perhaps, the tenants can't get answers on. Some great examples of what happens with these buildings is sometimes it looks like the building is, at risk for one reason or another. And it turns out, the government agency or somebody talks to the owner, and the owner says, well, the reason it's in bad condition is because I'm about to undergo a big rehab. And so the tenants shouldn't worry. I'm going to do a big rehab. I'm not going to sell the building. And so sometimes it's just a conversation, and sometimes the owner's a bad communicator with the tenants and others. So all this to say, we are working really hard. We've got a pretty good, big list of buildings in Woodlawn right now. And what we're working with this interagency group to do is to really focus on those properties in Woodlawn, narrow down the list to the ones that look like they might be at risk, and then spend a lot of time looking at each of those properties to see what's really happening. And like I said, to really try to keep those subsidies in place and those buildings affordable.
Quick question, Stacy.
Yeah.
So you're referring to this pool of properties that you're looking at as government assisted. Would that include properties that are receiving low-income housing tax credits as well?
Yeah, so I could go through all the different subsidies, but absolutely yes. Let me be a little bit clear though. So low-income housing tax credit building, that has a restriction on rents, which is great.
Right.
It's nice that they keep the rents at a certain level. But if I only earn $10,000 a year, that doesn't necessarily help me. Like that the rent is at $900 instead of $1,200. It's $900 is better than $1,200. But if I'm really extremely low income, what's going to really help me is what we call a rental subsidy. And that's really going to help me pay the rent. So low-income housing tax credits, that's one entire section of our government assisted properties. Another is project-based Section 8. And that project-based Section 8, those are government contracts that do exactly what I just described. They act kind of like, well, they're attached to the building. But if I earn only $10,000 a year, I pay 30% of my income. And then this contract pays the rest. So there's different kinds of subsidies. What we don't count, so we're counting kind of buildings. What we don't count are individual housing choice vouchers, tenant-based subsidies, which I think Woodlawn also has a lot of households with housing choice vouchers. But when we talk about subsidized buildings, we're not really counting those because those are just scattered around in lots of different buildings. But definitely tax credit buildings are on the list, yes.
So Stacy, how you doing? This is Marcus.
Hi.
Is there any way that we can get a list of those buildings that may be at risk sooner than later? Because with the STOP organization, Southside Together Organizing for Power, and what we have found out in the past is that a lot of tenants within these properties, a lot of them don't know their actual tenant rights. And a lot of them don't know that these buildings are really actually under contract and that they can lose their subsidy once the contract actually expires. So along with our organization and a lot of other organizations that work with housing, what they do is go in and help tenants understand their rights, make them knowledgeable on exactly what's going on, and then also work with other entities to create some assurance that these buildings remain and stay affordable to those residents and people who actually need those affordable units within Woodlawn. So I understand that you all have the Interagency Council, but it'd be a great help if you can work along with organizations that's doing the same kind of work that you all are doing as well.
And that is, you just described the perfect model that we have done in different areas. We've worked with the Jane Addams Senior Caucus on a building, a senior building in West Humboldt Park. We did exactly what you just described. We knew that the property, I've got several examples of this where the tenant groups, the community, the grassroots groups, as you're describing, that STOP is, and that you work with others, they're the key. In these buildings where the owners are being very unhelpful, where they're not being responsive, the tenants are actually the key to preserving the building. And we have many examples like that. So I agree with you. And so I think, but again, the first part is narrowing it down, because like I said, sometimes a property looks like it's at risk and it's not. And so we need to sort of like do that investigation first, and then, make sure everyone's got all the right information. And then again, if there's a property that really is at risk because this owner isn't being helpful, we know they're not going to preserve the subsidy. That is precisely when we can't be effective. That's when the community groups, that's when the tenant groups, that's when the tenants themselves really kick into action, because they do have rights. And there's a lot of great work that we've done to preserve buildings. And again, wouldn't have happened without the partnership of those groups.
I have a question. This is Tara Madison, and some of the things that you're mentioning. And I did add in the chat that a lot of us on this call, is particularly the STOP members, are part of the National Alliance of HUD Tenants for probably close to a decade. Now, I know I recently read that the state of Illinois, the Illinois Housing Development Corporation probably is really pushing for the low-income housing tax credit program to spur development. One issue I think we need to discuss is that tenant groups are defined differently under low-income housing tax credit programs than they are under this HUD Section 8-based developments. So, and then my second concern is that what normally happens when these buildings want to change hands is, I think it's referred to as a 1033 exchange or something like that, where one affordable housing development that already had owner that already has a background in affordable housing or working with subsidy-based, them just switching hands, maybe at close to or near the end of their contract. And what happens is that sometimes, and this might be something that's going on with Island Terrace now, and that gap from that owner leaving and a new owner coming in, the maintenance on that building. There's been many stories, we have many tenant groups. During that moment in time of that exchange taking place or that sale, the tenants are left sometimes with no really maintenance. And I know there are some owners that private and for-profit and nonprofit that don't want to be responsible for the property until it's actually in their hands. They don't want the previous owner's issues, but that leaves tenants in limbo. So I want to know if the Interagency Council can discuss with us more meetings to talk about when these transitions take place and holding not only the previous owner accountable, but the new owners too, to making sure that the tenants during this, and sometimes the transition can take a year, that they are still in safe, clean, affordable housing during this transition. I need some of the things to line up more correctly, because under REACT, they're working now to make changes because HUD didn't come in and check for mold. It didn't come in and check for lead. And a lot of the community members that I work with, there are issues of mold and lead in units that don't get tested for because they weren't on the REACT sheet. So what we do as an advocacy group is we tell our tenants, you need to call and make a building code violation with the city of Chicago, and we got to build a case up from there. Now that's a large load sometimes for an individual to carry. So we're going to need partnership with your council to make sure that we are actually addressing those issues on the ground with the people that are living in here and living through the process, and make the correction so that we can continue to have faith both in the local agencies here as well as our federal housing agency.
Yeah, I mean, I would just respond by saying, you know, Woodlawn is lucky to have someone as informed as you, as a tenant leader, as someone who's working on these issues. So I will say, you're right. I mean, you know, the project-based Section 8 HUD, that's a HUD subsidy, and they have a lot stronger tenant organizing rules and regulations. The tax credit program goes through the Department of Treasury, completely different government, you know, and I'm sure you know all this, and that's why they don't have those same strong tenant organizing allowances. But I'm glad you raised that. I knew that, but I actually had not thought of that as being a big problem. And I have a theory why not, but let's not get into that. I'd love to follow up with you on these and another couple of other issues. Okay. I think that the transition between a property that's in poor condition and the old owner who stopped caring and the new owner that doesn't own it, it is unfortunately very common, and it is a problem. And like you said, these transactions take a really long time, and it's not fair that the tenants have to suffer through these conditions through that time. So yeah, I'd love to hear, especially if you're in touch with NAT, the National Association. I mean, I think that if maybe there's some best practices along those lines of having, you know, the old owner and the new owner working together, I'd love to talk more about that. I think you've raised some really important issues. Thank you.
No, thank you. We'll appreciate it because Miss Williams, she's the Tenant Association President for Island Terrace, which is actually right now experiencing this. And of course, Savannah Marcus, Miss Payne, we're all here. Yes, we've all been working with the National Alliance of HUD Tenants Group for more than a decade.
That's great. That's great. And I should say, it's not my full-time job, so I'm not the biggest fixer in the world, but I do think that, hearing about best practices, and I think it's a very strong thing to have all these government agencies at the table together. So if there's anything, let's put our heads together and maybe there's something, something we can do. Thank you again. Other questions? Oh, Aaron, you're 10 minutes. Woo, perfect timing. Aaron's like 7:09. We got 10 minutes. 7:19.
Yeah. And then Jeff and Stacy, if you can send me your presentations out, I can send that out to people so they can look and review and try to get into your interactive resources that are in your presentations as well.
Great.
Well, if there's no more questions, I can move on to our next part of the agenda. If there is anything else, though. Esther, looks like you have something to say. You came off of mute.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, thank you, Stacy. I was here for your backup, but you handled that with aplomb, and I didn't really have a whole lot to add. So great presentation.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Stacy and Jeff, for taking time out of your evenings and presenting with us. And the data is very helpful, especially as we think about the implementation of programs and what other types of information we want to keep track of to make sure that our efforts in this group and the programs that we're launching are having an impact in the lives of people and housing conditions in Woodlawn. So in our last 10 minutes of our time together, I'm just going to review and recap. Can you all see my screen? I feel like this would be, you always did that for thank you, every virtual meeting. So this is just a look back at our timeline of what we've done. So the ordinance was passed in September of 2020. As the commissioner kind of recaps the timeline from her work with you all in 2019 and in early 2020. And then there was the break for COVID and then back at it in September. And in December of 2020, we had implementation planning meetings with Alderwoman Taylor and Hairston. And then since then, January through today, we have been meeting with the Alderwoman's office and with the working group. Just to recap, we have had 7 total working group meetings. We had 2 in March, 1 in April, 1 in June, 2 in July, and then the one today we're having. And then I've met with the Alderwoman 16 times since December of 2020. The most recent one being today, actually, before this meeting. So we've had several meetings. I will say, what I can speak to her internally that happens is people want to know their opinions of the working group, want to know what is going on with the working group and what your feedback is. So what we're going to be doing for, the ordinance stipulates that, as the commissioner pointed out, that we minimally will be reaching out meeting with you all in February. That is, my plan is to continue to keep you all in the loop as we launch these programs. Esther, last working group meeting presented on the PAIR program and how to move forward with, what that program is. And then Stacy's colleague at CAC, Jonah, has presented on the Woodlawn Loan Fund. That program was launched and already has launched, and we are making movements there. So for the rest of this year, we'll be launching, initiating the programs, building in your feedback, and then we will continue to meet with the Alderwoman to keep a pulse on what is going in the community. Again, I will continue to meet with you all. But here's an overview of all the programs, again, put in the ordinance. For the opt-in program, we will continue to work closely with the CCLT. They are finalizing their policy decisions inside the CCLT to be able to start the opt-in program. The CCLT has closed on a property in Woodlawn for housing preservation, and that they are working to rehab and make as a 2-flat and do for sale for affordable for sale units that will be long-term affordability. So we've talked about what outreach should look like, and Network of Woodlawn will be working with NHS for outreach for the long-term homeowner improvement grant, and hopefully we'll start by the beginning of 2022. We're just finalizing the new agreement with the funding source. For tenants' right of first refusal, that actually is done today. I will show you all that website, but we've updated our website with the information for the flyer and I will send this out to you all with the presentation from today and the flyer that you all can share with people. It also has the posting and summary of tenants' rights on there. For Renew Woodlawn, hopefully the program will be launched by the end of 2021. We are working with our legal department in finalizing that agreement. New home development, hopefully the land prep, which I told you, like after that process will still take 18 to 24 months. So the initial part of that work will start in 2022. We are prepared already to start in monitoring and ensuring that local developers are doing a local hiring plan and local developers are preference. So that's for our family, that's along with BINA. Our loan fund launched in April 2021. We've already closed on 1 property, which is between 9 to 12 units, which Jonah shared with us in the last meeting. And half of these units will be affordable to families at 80% area median income. And there's several developers who are interested and in the pipeline for this program. And yeah, so and then PAIR, we conducted outreach with you all last month, and then we'll be moving forward. And then, so next steps, we'll check out the tenant opportunity to purchase information. Again, I'll show you this, but then please look out for this when I send it to you. We'll be working internally, and I'll be communicating with you all to ensure that you are aware and then get your feedback, just probably in a more virtual place. And then program and marketing material will also be shared with you all as they're created. And our next reporting meeting, which will go over more data and checking in on the progress of implementation and being sure on what kind of proactive steps we need to take, which the ordinance calls out as well, will happen in February of 2022. That seems like forever from now, but it will. I will be in contact with you all throughout the time, and I will show you the. Can you all still see my screen for the housing website? Great. So here, this is the same website that I've been.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Here's the same website that I've been sharing with you all. We've moved things around. So here's where the recordings have gone. It's just down below. It still has the ordinance overview. And then over here, it talks about the intent to sell. So this is what owners will have to post when they go to sell, to be in accordance in public areas, so that, and it gives tenants at least 30 days to think about inform if they would like to take that. And then there's this is it does trigger other time periods after they say yes for people to get financing together, and other time to do their due diligence. Sorry, they have 90 days to do that. So here's that on their website. And then here's a copy of our flyer. Again, I will send this out for this information. It kind of just summarizes what the program is and lets tenants know. This is for tenants, all tenants inside of Woodlawn who are in buildings with 9 or more units are under this ordinance and have a first right of refusal with some exceptions for purchasing their buildings. We also added the link to the Woodlawn Loan Fund. I sent that out to you all, but the people who are interested in this program can also go to this website and get access to the Woodlawn Loan Fund on CIC's website. I know there's a lot of information. I'm trying to make sure that we end on time and I don't take more of your evening, but I see that there is a hand up by Savannah. Okay, so I see in your comment in the chat, we are, so yes, we are working, following up. We've gotten your feedback for that. We're following up with the alderwoman. But basically what is I guess shown from our interactions is that there's more thought and planning that needs to go into the 52 lots. So we're working to, hold what we have available, and then talking with the alderman for a longer and DPD for what is visioning and more engagement and planning process to look like around that in Woodlawn. Because what has come up from our working group meetings were not only that we have the lots, but also thinking about what is the typology and the look and the building types that are coming up. So we want to make sure that we're having this conversation holistically, but we'll work on holding what we have had based on the feedback. And I will get back to you on the timeline for those things, because that is more of a DPD thing, and we'll be we're working to schedule a meeting with the Alderwoman's office with DPD. I will let you know, but hopefully we'll have this meeting scheduled by early September. The first meetings will be just with the Alderwoman's office and DPD, just figure out the logistics. But the whole process will be, DPD is committed, and I know the Alderwoman is also committed to a community process for what that looks like. Any other questions, comments, or concerns? I just want to say I've appreciated working with you all. This was project number 1 given to me I feel like day 1, or maybe the commissioner gave me 3 days before getting this project, but I have deeply enjoyed working on this project and working with you all. I feel like it's helped push me to grow, and it's just pushed me to continue to be more committed to equity and community engagement for the city. And we will continue. Again, this is not the end. This is I will continue to work with you all and continue to update you all, and I'll send out the recordings and presentations before the end of the week from this meeting. But I deeply appreciate you all and the efforts that you've put in. Commissioner, are there any parting words that you want to offer?
I think you deserve the parting words for the evening, Aaron.
Great, thank you all. Well, I know there's a lot going on in our country and our city and our global community. So I hope that you all take time to take care of yourselves as well, because you are doing community care with this work.
Thank you, Aaron.
All right, have a good night all. Bye.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you, Aaron.